Emergency shelter is a life-saving intervention for people who are experiencing homelessness and have no other safe alternatives. However, given the overrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities among people experiencing homelessness, which is caused by historical and ongoing structural racism, it is important that emergency shelters examine their data to ensure that they are not themselves perpetuating racial disparities. To that end, the National Alliance to End Homelessness has developed a simple flowchart to provide some considerations that shelters should be making to ensure equitable access and outcomes, and this presentation is meant to support the use of that flowchart. The flowchart and presentation do not cover every possible way that biases could manifest in access to and outcomes from emergency shelter, but they are meant to serve as a tool that provides a foundation for shelters to think about where disparities may be happening. This kind of analysis for the potential for perpetuating racial inequity is even more important during public health crises like the coronavirus pandemic, because people of color are not only more likely to experience homelessness, but also to die from COVID-19. So the imperative to ensure equitable access to the life-saving resource of shelter is even greater now. The first thing to consider when thinking about equitable access to shelter is whether or not shelter access happens via coordinated entry in your community. If it does, the Alliance has created a similar flowchart and presentation that outlines some of the considerations that communities should make to ensure that coordinated entry does not perpetuate racial disparities, and you can access that information on our website. A next step in thinking about how racial disparities might occur in emergency shelters is to consider diversion. If your shelter does diversion, you should be collecting demographic data on who is being served with diversion, the types of diversion assistance being provided, and the amounts of that assistance if it's financial. That data should be analyzed to determine whether there are racial disparities in any of those outcomes so that you can adjust your practices accordingly to ensure racially equitable diversion. The entry phase is where shelters must be diligent about examining their data to determine racially equitable access. Many common barriers to entry that shelters create can have disparate impacts on people of color due to historical and ongoing structural racism, especially Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people. For example, because of the long and ongoing reality of racism in our criminal justice system, Black people are much more likely to have been targeted by that system than white people. So if your shelter screens people out for having criminal histories, you are likely disproportionately excluding Black people with that barrier to entry. Additionally, if your shelter has minimum income or employment requirements for entry, you may be disproportionately impacting people of color because they are more likely to be unemployed without benefits and have more barriers to employment or to being approved for income benefits programs like SSI and TANF. And again, those are all due to historical and ongoing structural racism in our country's employment and income support systems. It should be pointed out here that even if your data demonstrate that you are sheltering more people of color than white people, you may still be having negative racial impacts on people who don't get into your shelter. That is why it is important to collect data on both entries into and rejection from shelter. Next, your shelter should gather and analyze racial and ethnic data about exits from your program. Determine who is involuntarily exited from shelter and why. Are the consequences of your shelter rules having a disparate impact on guests of color? Keep track of positive and negative exits and which types of exits are happening by race. For example, are more white people exiting to permanent housing and more Black people exiting back to the streets? That's important information to know for improving case management, connections to landlords and social services, and many other shelter practices that can impact outcomes. In addition to the exits you know about, what is the racial makeup of your shelter's unknown exits? If you see racially inequitable numbers there, can you come up with ways to ensure better connection and follow-up with guests of color? Finally, shelters should collect data on the race and ethnicity of people who returned to shelter and where they were living before they returned. We know that because of ongoing and historical structural racism, Black and Indigenous people experiencing homelessness may not have access to the social supports they need to maintain stability after leaving shelter. They're also more likely to experience landlord discrimination and other negative effects of our country's history of housing and economic segregation. If you see disparities in returns to shelter, think about ways to improve case management and housing and service connections for guests of color. For all of these topics, we know that having staff who are racially, ethnically, culturally, and experientially reflective of people experiencing homelessness improves outcomes for guests of color. So shelters should consider the racial makeup of their staff and take steps to improve diversity where needed. It is also important across the shelter experience that all staff who influence outcomes are trained in cultural humility and responsiveness and are aware of the barriers that historical and ongoing structural racism create for people of color getting into housing, like lower credit scores or higher targeting by the criminal justice system. Staff should be trained to address those barriers when working to help guests make positive exits from shelter, including being mindful of racial and economic segregation in housing opportunities. As you have seen, there are many points during the process of getting into and exiting from emergency shelter where racial inequities can happen, and you won't know if you have inequities if you don't analyze your data. There are also many considerations to make for improving outcomes if you do find inequities in your shelter data. We have covered just a few of those in this presentation, and much more information can be found in the action steps created by the Alliance's Racial Equity Network. You can access that link via the flowchart that accompanies this presentation.